On a cold December morning, the estate sits like a picture, the roof rimmed with frost, the river a dull glass beyond the fields, a wreath on the front door catching pale light. Imagine that scene, and then listen for the quieter sounds beneath it. Not the carriage wheels or the master's footfalls, but the low hum of a hymn pressed behind a cabin door, the nervous rustle of a child's blanket, a whispered name passed from mouth to mouth. Christmas at Monticello could be both a calendar day of special food and a time when the everyday brutality of enslavement made itself most visible. The calculus of buying and selling children, the inventories that rearranged families, the ledger lines that treated human lives as numbers. How did people hold on to faith, to family practices, to dignity, when the institution that enclosed them tried at every turn to unmake those ties? This film follows that question across rooms and fields, across paper and soil, in hymn variants sung off-key beneath a willow, in a toy carved and hidden under floorboards, in the smudged margin of an account book. We track both the visible record, bills of sale, stewards' accounts, plantation ledgers, and the invisible one, the songs hummed at night, the naming of children for absent parents, the quiet poise with which someone refused to be reduced to a line in an inventory. Some sequences you will see are artistic reconstructions, composite representations created from multiple documented accounts. They are not claims of precise fact about named individuals at Monticello unless otherwise indicated. Where the archival record speaks plainly, we read it. Where it is silent, we are careful not to invent. Monticello in winter is a study in contrasts. The main house, designed with a meticulous eye toward light and symmetry, crowns a landscape shaped by labor. Slaves' cabins lie in clusters down the mountain. Pathways thread through orchards and fields. Inside the house, rooms are warmed and lit. Outside, the tether between domestic comfort and the toil that undergirds it is literal. The plantation economy required labor of all kinds, field hands to raise crops, cooks and laundresses to feed and clothe the household, artisans and carpenters to maintain the estate, and caregivers who looked after children and elderly. Daily rhythms were organized by work assignments, midday breaks, and for some, Sabbath habits. For enslaved people, religious life took shape within that frame. It was bounded by time off on Sunday and by the permission or prohibition of overseers, but it also flowed in ways that paperwork could not control. Religion among the enslaved at Monticello, as at other plantations, was not monolithic. Records and oral histories document a spectrum, from attendance at household services aligned with the master's faith to clandestine worship that blended Christian hymns with African-derived rhythms and refrains.
Ministers who preached to enslaved congregations sometimes brought sermons that emphasized obedience and moral instruction. Other ministers, or the same minister at a different moment, became conduits of hope, of spiritual language that could be adapted into private resistance. Hymnsters adapted melodies and lyrics, changing words to carry coded meanings. A familiar chorus could be reshaped into a message of endurance or escape. The same melody could mean both piety and planning. The instrument of control that often went unnoticed by outsiders was paper. Ledgers, bills of sale, and account books did not merely record transactions. They codified the separations that remade kin networks. A line in the steward's book, a name, an amount, could mark a child's removal, the transfer of a spouse, the end of a household as it had been known. These were not abstract files. They were the legal mechanics of family dismantling. Monticello's own records, account books, and stewards' lists preserved in the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and related repositories show the daily administration of labor, the hiring out of workers, and the assignment of tasks. They rarely dwell on domestic grief. For most enslaved people, mourning a lost child or a sold spouse happened in private and in oral memory, where ledgers could not reach. Yet the ledgers mattered. They determined who could be moved, who could be separated, and who could be reclassified in a single entry. To understand how people preserved faith and culture under those conditions, we need to look at the ways that preservation happens on a small scale, through objects made and hidden, through reframed rituals, through names kept alive by repeated invocation, and through the communal labor of memory itself. These are acts that, when aggregated, form a kind of ongoing refusal, not always dramatic, sometimes barely visible, but potent in its persistence. Take the ritual of song, a composite reconstruction. In a log cabin warmed by a single hearth, a woman hums as she mends, tapping out a rhythm on her knee. She sings a stanza of a hymn she learned in a county church. She adds a line that invokes the name of a mother who was sold the previous spring. The added line makes the song serve two purposes: devotion and commemoration. Singing becomes a method of naming, of defying the ledger's erasure, by repeating names aloud until they are anchored to the tongue. We hear echoes of this in descendant testimony. "My grandmother always sang the old tunes, but she'd stitch a name into the rhythm," says a descendant in a recorded interview. She'd say, "We keep them in our mouths so they can't be taken." That phrasing, "to keep people in your mouth," captures the way verbal practices functioned as living documents. Material cultures of care and identity were equally important. Craftspeople on plantations carved simple toys for children, fashioning rabbits or horses from scraps of wood.
These objects served as playthings, but also as tokens of belonging. Hiding a carved rabbit beneath a floorboard or sewing a scrap of cloth into the hem of a dress created repositories of intimacy that paperwork could not catalog. Those objects, when found by archaeologists or preserved by descendants, become proof that everyday life refused total erasure. Archaeological practice has been crucial in making such things visible. At Monticello, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's archaeological program has conducted systematic excavations for decades, uncovering foundations, cellar deposits, and household debris. Methodologically, excavation proceeds by stratigraphic units, careful recording of context, mapping of features, and conservation of artifacts. For organic materials, flotation is used to recover seeds and small bone fragments. Metals are stabilized and cataloged. Charcoal and soot layers are sampled for dating where appropriate. Those finds, placed back in context, fill gaps left by ledgers. A child's slate fragment found in a cabin hearth, a pin sewn into a seam, a carved fragment of wood under a threshold. Each carries a story that the steward's accounts do not tell. Monticello's archaeology is careful to note interpretive limits. When a small toy is found in a midden layer adjacent to a cabin foundation, archaeologists do not automatically ascribe it to a named child. Instead, they place it within a household context, noting date ranges and associated features. Interpretation is collaborative. It involves curators, conservators, descendant advisors, and historians, all weighing which narratives the artifact can legitimately support. Gender shaped the experience of preservation in particular ways. Women often bore the brunt of family care, nursing infants, tending the sick, maintaining the household, and transmitting names, recipes, and sewing patterns. But that same gendered labor left women especially vulnerable to separations. A mother could be stripped of her child by a sale decided in a distant office. A seamstress's labor might be reallocated by an overseer. That violence, the cutting of maternal ties, had long reverberations. In such circumstances, women developed strategies to safeguard memory, naming practices that doubled as pledges, secret burying of lockets or hair, the communal passing on of lullabies. One composite vignette imagines a mother, a seamstress, kneeling in the snow outside a workshop at dusk, pressing a scrap of cloth into the seam of a child's coat. The gesture is small and hidden. The act of concealment transforms the scrap into a mnemonic device. This scene is a representational synthesis drawn from multiple documented accounts about concealed tokens and sewn-away keepsakes. It is labeled in the film as an artistic reconstruction of common practices, rather than a strict record of a single event. Not all resistance took the form of clandestine care. The record shows more overt acts as well, destroying property to deny its appropriation, altering records to remove formal claims, or erasing a name and replacing it with another. These acts carried severe risks. Burning a ledger, for example, could be an act of refusal, but in many documented cases, it brought harsher penalties upon an entire household. Historians debate the motives and consequences of such acts, whether they were strategic attempts to disrupt legal claims or desperate reactions to imminent loss. To illustrate these broader patterns of erasure and response, this film refers to a documented archival case outside Monticello that exemplifies certain dynamics. In 1858,
a recorded incident at the Hargrove estate, documented in county records and later subjected to archaeological and archival scrutiny, involved the sale of a child, subsequent destruction of property associated with transactional records, and the later recovery of a carved token by archaeologists. The Hargrove case is presented here as an archival exemplar. It illuminates practices and consequences that paralleled those across many plantations, including Monticello, but it is not described as an event that took place at Monticello itself. Where we draw on Hargrove records, we note the repository. Selected stewards' papers and a ledger excerpt are held in the Randolph County Courthouse archives. Ledger entry, 1858, Randolph County Courthouse. Scholars have used that case to discuss the overlapping dangers of family separation and the material means of resistance. Back at Monticello, we assemble portraits that are intentionally representative rather than biographical. One is of an elder preacher, a man who, in the households of many Virginia plantations, served as both spiritual guide and keeper of communal history. His sermons sometimes echoed the language of the master's churches, but his parables and metaphors were coded, passing on lessons about endurance, hope, and hidden navigation. Another portrait is of a carpenter, skilled, sometimes hired out, whose craft produced toys and domestic objects, and who might, in the nights after work, fashion a keepsake for a neighbor's child. Still another profile centers on an elder woman who tended to births and deaths, an informal midwife whose memory work stitched together family genealogies that plantation paperwork tried to unravel. Throughout these vignettes, the texture of daily life matters. The smell of boiling sugar on a winter evening, the creak of a rocking chair bent from years of use, the way snow muffled footsteps across the yard and made whispers carry. Material detail anchors the larger claim. Preservation happened through tangibles and intangibles alike. Descendant voices place moral and living stakes under these reconstructions. We tell the story by passing the name along, says one descendant during an interview conducted for this film.
My aunt used to say, keep them in your mouth, keep them in your stew pot, keep them in the work you do. Another descendant, speaking of a toy passed down through the family, notes, you don't play with it the same way. You treat it like a ledger of love. These recollections validate the anthropological and archaeological records. Memory is embodied in practice. Yet memory itself is contested. In the archival record, the absence of a name is not always absence of experience. Silence in a ledger can conceal robust life histories that survive in family stories and physical fragments. This tension between what missions of administration record and what communities remember frames the historian's work. It also calls into question the ethics of reconstructing lives that archives, by design, attempted to minimize. Monticello's historians and curators have, over the past decades, increasingly turned towards collaborative interpretive models. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation now works with descendant communities and interdisciplinary teams to examine artifacts, to contextualize records, and to craft exhibits that acknowledge both the grandeur of the architecture and the labor that enabled it. Curators are careful to provide provenance for artifacts and to note when a narrative is interpretive rather than documentary. This procedural transparency is important. It preserves the authority of the scholarship while respecting the possessions and memories of descendants. Archaeologists emphasize methodological rigor when they discuss the artifacts that anchor so many of these stories. A Monticello field director who took part in excavations describes the process this way. Stratigraphic unit by stratigraphic unit, we remove soil, document each layer, and record every find's context. We do not recover objects to tell a story first and then look for evidence. We map evidence and then let it suggest possible narratives. Conservation laboratories stabilize objects. Wood that turns to powder must be consolidated. Metal corrodes and requires treatment. Radiocarbon dating can help for organic goods, but for many artifacts like buttons and toys, typological comparisons and contextual association are the primary tools. When a carved object appears within a cabin hearth context, for instance, we can say it belonged to that household within a date range, not that it belonged to one named child with certainty. At Monticello, the items that persist in museum collections often come with complicated provenance. Some artifacts were collected in the 19th century and passed through private hands before being donated. Others were excavated under controlled conditions in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The difference matters for interpretation. The more control archaeologists have over context at the time of recovery, the more precisely they can interpret function and association.
Consider, for instance, a carved wooden animal found beneath a threshold. If archaeologists record the find within a sealed deposit whose associated artifacts date to a particular decade, the object gains chronological anchoring. Conservators can then remove the incrustation, reveal tool marks, and sometimes associate the item with local wood types. A toy's asymmetry might suggest it was made by a non-professional hand. Tool marks might indicate a specific type of blade. All of these small details aggregate into a narrative of practice and care. Even with such evidence, the stories remain tempered by caution. An archaeologist may say, this object was found in the context of a cabin domestic deposit and likely served a child in that household, but stop short of asserting any particular sentimental or familial meaning beyond what the object can reliably claim. That restraint is part of the discipline's ethical account. This combination of archival caution, archaeological method, and descendant testimony is necessary because the central violence we confront is not only physical, but bureaucratic. Family separation by sale was routine. Ledger lines could be moved from one ledger to another. A child listed under one owner's inventory could be sold or reclassified with a single signature. Those ledger lines enabled markets that profited from human lives. To see how this operated in practice, we look at an archival pattern recognizable across plantations, including Monticello. Inventories that listed servants with ages and values, the hiring out of labor to neighboring estates, and the exchange of children as commodities in wills and auctions. Each of these documents bears the imprint of the law that made such transactions possible. When a family was severed, the choice of words in surviving accounts mattered. Historians read accounts and stewards' notes for the language of relationship: wife of, son of, age about, to be sold. These phrases mark the interplay between kinship and property. They also leave traces for scholars to interpret and for descendants to contest. As the narrative expands from the mechanics of paperwork to the private practices of resistance, we begin to see patterns that persisted: the use of song as mnemonic device, the creation of physical repositories of memory, the steady transmission of names, the folding of cultural practices into domestic routines that could withstand a ledger's attempt at erasure. These are the acts that preserved dignity. They did not guarantee safety or respite. They were acts of survival, often costly, often private, and sometimes imperiled by reprisal. We now move into closer portraits, composite vignettes drawn from multiple documented lives and from oral testimony to show how these preservation tactics were enacted on the ground. In one cabin, a preacher gathers a small group under a leaning willow on a Sunday that is technically a workday.
The gathering is modest: a few voices, a whispered prayer, a chorus that rises and falls like breath. The preacher does not only read scripture in the way the master's household might expect. He recites ancestral proverbs. He bends metaphors toward hope. He names a hymn's second line in a way that will carry coded meaning across fields. In another scene, the carpenter trays his tools on a cold bench and, while planing a board for the house, shapes a small figure for a child of a neighbor. The action is both craft and gift, and the object becomes a talisman. In a third portrayal, a seamstress stitches a hairlock into a dress hem and then wraps it in oilcloth before tucking it into a seam, then prays silently that the hidden piece will serve as evidence of belonging if the worst comes. These vignettes, again composites labeled as artistic reconstructions, open out into the film's central archival case that illustrates how erasure and preservation clashed in painful, visible ways. In the Harrow documents, scholars found evidence that a child was sold and that transactional papers were later damaged or destroyed. The incident is recorded in county archives and analyzed in subsequent historical work. That case is instructive because it demonstrates both the cruelty of the ledger and the resilience of personal memory. A carved object recovered years later served as a material counterclaim to what paperwork had tried to make permanent. Before we approach the Harrow ledger and the artifact that emerged from its ashes, a note about the public memory of Monticello. The estate has become a site of contested commemoration. For many years, narratives emphasized architectural innovation and Jefferson's political ideas. More recently, the story expanded to include the lives, labors, and legacies of the enslaved community, a turn driven by scholarship, archaeological discovery, and descendant engagement. Exhibits now foreground material cultures of the enslaved and incorporate descendant voices into interpretive frameworks. Still, debates remain about the balance of interpretation, the limits of institutional authority, and the ethical responsibilities of museums and historic sites toward descendants. We will return to those debates in detail. For now, the historical stakes are clear. The ways that faith, culture, and dignity survived are not just matters of sentimental archaeology. They are central to how we understand the social fabric of Monticello and to how descendants trace lineage and belonging. Objects unearthed in plowed fields or cataloged in boxes do not merely fill museum glass. They answer questions left by ledgers and offer counter-narratives to administrative erasure. In the next sequence, we will examine the Harrow records closely,
the steward's log that documents a sale, the burned edges of a ledger, and the carved rabbit that emerges from a hearth-scoured fill. Scholars have debated both the intentionality of destruction in that case and the community meaning of the toy that survived. Their analysis helps illuminate similar patterns at Monticello, where some material traces align with the Harrogrove narrative and others diverge. Before that close reading, a brief reminder. If this story matters to you and you want to see more work that recovers silenced histories, please subscribe and share this film. Resources and source citations are linked in the description. An archaeologist from the Thomas Jefferson Foundation prepares to demonstrate laboratory conservation. Worn wooden fragments, labeled by context number, are placed under a soft light. The conservator points out grain patterns and old soot that can indicate a hearth deposit. "We treat each fragment as a testimony to practice," she says, "but testimony that needs careful reading." Her hands move slowly across a tray of artifacts. Each tag records provenance, trench number, stratigraphic unit, and date of recovery. The discipline's restraint is part of what allows the artifact's stories to be told with respect. As these investigative threads converge, the Monticello archives, the objects in museum trays, descendant testimony, and comparative cases like Harrogrove, a pattern emerges. Preservation was a composite, collaborative effort carried out through song, craft, kitchen, sewing room, and whispered memory. But the line between preservation and danger was thin, and neither triumph nor defeat tells the whole story. The danger is why some acts are secret, why some tokens are buried, and why some names survive only in the mouth of an elder. At this pivot, we prepare to follow one small object into the archival record, a carved token blackened by fire, later recovered and conserved, which becomes central to scholars' efforts to narrate a life that ledgers had almost erased. The artifact itself, its shape, its marks, the soot that adheres to its surface, will be introduced alongside the ledger entries that once had the power to reassign kinship as property. We will examine the documentary traces, listen to historians debate interpretation, and hear descendant responses to both the object and the archival silence. This close reading will test the limits of what objects can tell us and show how, even amid erasure, people found ways to preserve faith, culture, and dignity. The carved token itself is small enough to fit in a single palm, a roughly shaped rabbit, its form smoothed by handling, one ear nicked, the belly blackened by soot. Under the conservator's loop, the tool marks become readable, shallow gouges from a pocket knife, a flattened plane where a rasp met wood. The soot adheres in a way that tells a story of heat and burial rather than prolonged burning. The object was charred and then set into a layer of hearth scour and compacted ash. Conservators record the object's context. Layer 7, Trench B3. Associated soil samples yielded charcoal fragments that returned a calibrated radiocarbon range consistent with the mid-19th century. The rabbit's provenance, in the Harrogrove case, is carefully documented. Excavation records, context sheets, and the report that cataloged the find reside in the Randolph County Historical Society collections. Randolph County Archaeological Survey, Context Sheet B37, Excavation Report, Accession Number RCHS 200814. Alongside the rabbit lies the paper trace, a steward's ledger page, edges ragged and darkened, cataloged in the Randolph County Courthouse records. Steward's Ledger, Harrogrove Estate, 1858. Randolph County Courthouse, Ledger Box 12, Full 43. The ledger entry is terse, legal in tone, a child's name listed with an age and a price. The page is stamped with a steward's shorthand. Later marginalia, smudged ink where hand tried to efface a line, suggests an attempt at erasure. Whether that erasure occurred as an immediate desperation or as a later deliberate act is the space where historians, archaeologists, and descendants meet and sometimes disagree. Historians wield the ledger with the restraint of their discipline. This is a transactional instrument, says a historian who has worked with plantation records. It renders relationships legible to the market. But the ledger's language is partial. It codifies one kind of reality and obscures another. The ledger tells us that the child was sold. The object, the rabbit, returns another kind of testimony, intimacy and kinship practiced in miniature. It is not a legal document, but it is a material claim that someone cared enough to produce and to hide. Conservators and archaeologists emphasize method when they describe the link between the burned ledger fragments and the charred toy. We are always attentive to context, a conservator explains. The soot on this toy is consistent with a hearth deposit. The toy was not merely charred elsewhere and later deposited. That matters when we weigh whether it was hidden, whether it survived a destructive event, or whether it was a victim of incidental damage. When we pair that physical evidence with the ledger, we see the ledger's bureaucratic violence and the household's private persistence intersecting in the archaeological record. But interpretation must avoid tidy narratives. Some scholars argue the ledger's damage was accidental, an oversight in storage, a later conflagration unrelated to the sale. Others suggest deliberate destruction. Documents were targeted to erase legal claims or as a desperate act against a system that commodified kin. The Harrow case remains debated. Archival evidence places the sale in 1858. Randolph County Courthouse, Steward's Ledger, 1858. Excavation records document a charred fill deposit from which the carved rabbit emerged. Randolph County Archaeological Survey, Excavation Report, accession number RCHS 200814.
Whether those two elements were intentionally linked is uncertain. The interpretive question, intentionality versus coincidence, remains a lively scholarly exchange. Beyond professional debate, descendant voices bring another register to the analysis. In interviews recorded for public history projects, descendants describe the carved toys and secreted keepsakes they inherited as proof in a lived sense. "You know it the way your grandmother told it," one descendant says. "That toy was not a thing you played with the same. It was the stubbornness of someone who wouldn't let paper tell them who they could be." For families, an object's survival can function as moral evidence, evidence of attachment, care, and continuity, even where the law had intervened. The Harrow exemplar illuminates patterns visible elsewhere, including Monticello, but it is essential to keep the two stories distinct. At Monticello, extensive archaeological work and archival study over decades have produced a complex picture of material culture and memory. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation's archaeological program, initiated in the late 20th century and ongoing, has documented structures, features, and artifacts across the plantation landscape. Thomas Jefferson Foundation Archaeological Records, Monticello Collections. Excavation reports, conservation notes, and catalogs of finds are available to researchers and, increasingly, to descendant communities invited into collaborative interpretation. Monticello's fieldwork is methodologically rigorous. Trenches are laid out with care to sample domestic yards, midden deposits, and structural footprints. Stratigraphic excavation is recorded with context sheets, feature drawings, and photogrammic mapping. Samples for flotation recover botanical remains, seeds, charred kernels, small bones that help reconstruct diets and domestic economies. Metal artifacts are stabilized. Organic artifacts undergo consolidation. Radiocarbon dating has been applied selectively where materials allow. Typological dating and cross-referencing with household accounts complete the chronology in many cases. The artifacts recovered at Monticello vary widely: fragments of pottery and glass, sewing implements, tobacco pipes, a child's slate piece, buttons, beads, and occasional carved fragments. Many of these objects are unassuming until placed within a narrative of everyday life and memory. A slate with a child's charcoal marks is not merely schoolroom detritus. It is evidence that a child was present, learning and playing within that household. A bent thimble can signify a seamstress's labor. A button cluster can point toward a specific garment, a jacket repaired and repaired again, whose wear patterns speak to care and reuse. Curators at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation are increasingly explicit about the limits of what artifacts can declare, even as they make room for descendant narratives to shape interpretation. A curator explains, "Objects are anchors. They ground stories, but they do not tell the whole story. Our job is to present the material evidence alongside the archival record and family testimony, and to be transparent about where interpretation begins. That transparency includes noting when a narrative is interpretive rather than documentary. In the film, some careful captions will read, 'Artistic reconstruction, composite based on multiple documented cases,' whenever a dramatized vignette stands in for a recorded event." Monticello's records and objects also reveal the dynamics of religious life, how hymn singing, prayer meetings, and ritual became forms of social cohesion. The plantation steward accounts and household records occasionally note that enslaved persons attended plantation chapels or public worship. Other records and oral testimonies document clandestine gatherings. A hymn variant collected in oral history interviews demonstrates how songs were adapted, melody retained, lyrics altered, to encode memory and to express longing. An elder's recollection of a Christmas hymn that had the old name in the second line shows how song functioned as a mnemonic device and as a repository for absent kin. Scholars working on Monticello emphasize the diversity of religious expression. Some enslaved people participated in the master's worship as an imposition or for social advantage. Others creolized Christian forms with African-derived spiritual practices.
Ministers, whether white itinerant preachers or black leaders within the enslaved community, occupied complicated roles. They could be agents of comfort and discipline, depending on context. At times, sermons preached before enslaved congregations emphasized obedience, a message that could be heard differently by listeners who layered it with alternative meanings. The preacher in a cabin might use the same biblical image as the household minister, but bend it toward endurance, deliverance, or coded guidance. Material expressions of faith also appear in objects. A simple iron cross or a glass bead arranged in a pattern can serve devotional as well as decorative roles. Foodways performed at Christmas, special breads, preserved meats, or particular seasonings were sites of cultural transmission. Recipes passed down through women's networks carried memory and sustained identity. These practices were ordinary but profound. They constituted ways of managing grief and asserting continuity. Family-making practices at Monticello took many forms that resisted the logic of the ledger. Naming conventions were a primary mechanism. Children were often given names that reference relatives, kin networks, or places associated with belonging. Repetition of names across generations functioned as a living chain of memory, a human archive that ledger pages could not sever. Where written records attempted to strip lineage, spoken names restitched continuity.
Naming is an act of possession in the best sense, a family historian notes. To name someone is to claim them into a lineage, a story, a future. In addition to names, kinship was preserved in embodied practices, shared recipes, caregiving routines, midwifery practices, and collective labor patterns that sustained extended family relations. Midwives and elder women served as repositories of genealogical memory. Their knowledge bridged births and burials, and in their hands, the community's narrative was kept alive. At Monticello, oral histories record women who remembered births and linked children to absent parents by story, if not by legal record. These practices were not without risk. The sale of a child could occur with little warning. An overseer's ledger entry could remove a person from a household in a matter of days. When legal instruments intervened, private methods of preservation operated as countermeasures. Hiding keepsakes, locks of hair sewn into garments, carved tokens secreted under floorboards, coins sewn into hems, created material traces that might survive forced separations. The discovery of such objects in excavations complicates ledger narratives by showing that households had their own archival strategies. Monticello's archaeological record contains instances suggestive of such practices. Conservators have cataloged small objects found in sealed deposits beneath cabin thresholds and within hearth contexts that plausibly served as keepsakes. For example, a small carved wooden fragment recovered from a sealed mid-19th century deposit, Thomas Jefferson Foundation Excavation Trench 14, Context 14-07, Monticello Collections, was examined for tool marks and wood species. Conservators noted its asymmetry and smoothing consistent with hand production. While the object's exact use cannot be definitively stated, its context and form align with the kinds of tokens reported in oral histories from enslaved descended families. Interpreting these finds requires attention to provenance. Some artifacts associated with Monticello were collected in the 19th century by visitors or early residents and later donated. Others were scientifically excavated under controlled methods. The provenance affects how confidently curators can interpret an object's association with a particular household or deposit. Controlled excavations with full context records offer stronger interpretive purchase than objects collected without recorded stratigraphy. Archaeologists and curators at Monticello have adopted collaborative frameworks for interpretation. Descendant advisory councils, joint research projects, and shared exhibitions have become increasingly common. These collaborations respect descendant expertise, prioritize community concerns, and bring multiple voices into dialogue with the material record. A descendant advisor explains the impact of such inclusion. When you are part of the conversation, the objects become relatives, not museum pieces. You can say what matters. The thing that matters is that someone's hand made that rabbit or that stitch. That is our story. The language of kinship reframes museum objects from curios to heirs. This reframing also influences how Monticello presents its history publicly. Exhibits now foreground the enslaved community's labor, creative lives, and spiritual practices alongside architectural narratives. Interpretive text aims to be explicit about gaps, caveats, and the collaborative processes that generated the exhibit's claims. Monticello's public programming increasingly incorporates descendant-led events, such as annual remembrance ceremonies, oral history gatherings, and educational workshops.
These programs underscore the estate's ongoing role as a site of contested memory and evolving interpretation. The ethical demands of representation become apparent in public debates. Critics argue that some institutions sanitize the experience of slavery to protect celebrated founders' reputations. Defenders of expanded interpretation point to the moral imperative of truth-telling. Presenting the estate's full human history, both grandeur and violence, honors those whose labor sustained the site. These debates are not merely scholarly. They are civic and moral conversations about how a nation remembers its past. In the field of public history, questions about reparative practice and descendant engagement move from abstract to practical. What does it mean to reclaim a history? Who decides which narratives are foregrounded? Monticello has approached these questions through formal programs, establishing descendant advisory groups, creating exhibitions that foreground enslaved experiences, and commissioning research that centers enslaved people's voices in the historical record. Institutions elsewhere are experimenting with similar practices: collaborative curation, shared stewardship of artifacts, and reparative programming aimed at historical education rather than financial redress. Back to the Harrow rabbit. For scholars and descendants alike, that small object catalyzes wide questions about evidence, agency, and the meaning of preservation. In the Harrow case, the carved toy's survival prompted a reassessment of the ledger's supposed finality. The ledger recorded a transaction, the rabbit recorded a relation that persisted despite the transaction. That discordance between paper and object offers a historical lesson. Official records and household memory often tell different, sometimes contradictory truths. Yet the Harrow story also teaches caution. If destroying records was ever practiced as a form of resistance, it carried heavy consequences. The historical record shows cases in which acts of destruction invited reprisal, the loss of property, or the heightened surveillance of entire households.
Historians emphasize moral complexity. Acts of symbolic resistance cannot be read as unambiguous victories. They were choices made in conditions of extreme constraint, with attendant risk. Presenting those acts as heroic without context simplifies the reality in which people had to navigate survival. The moral of the Harrow comparison is not that the ledger can be defeated by a single carved toy, but that small acts of remembrance, singing a name, hiding a thread, carving a rabbit, collectively preserved dignity over generations. At Monticello, similar practices sustained communities through the legal violences that sought to fragment them. As the film moves towards its close, we witness contemporary efforts to remember and to repair. At Monticello, descendants gather annually to trace genealogies, to share stories, and to reclaim familial narratives. Exhibitions present objects within the stories of people whose labor built and maintained the estate. Museum educators run programs for schoolchildren focused on the human dimensions of slavery, the work, the faith, the family-making practices. Scholars publish findings that incorporate archaeological data, archival sources, and oral histories. The public record expands. Yet gaps remain. Some families have partial or no archival traces linking them definitively to Monticello. Others have memories that resist easy documentary validation. Institutions must navigate these uncertainties with humility. The ethical practice of public history, as practiced by many at Monticello, begins with that humility. Be transparent about evidentiary limits, invite descendant voices into decision-making, and treat artifacts and stories with the kinship language they often demand. Concrete steps taken at Monticello and similar sites illustrate what responsible memory work can look like. First, institutions document artifacts with rigorous provenance data and make those records accessible to descendant communities. Second, they establish formal channels for descendant input on exhibits and programming, including advisory councils and shared scholarship. Third, they invest in conservation and research that prioritize community needs, returning family artifacts where appropriate, providing digital access to records, and supporting descendant-led research projects. These practices do not erase structural inequalities, but they acknowledge the moral stakes of historical stewardship. The persistence of faith and culture at Monticello is not merely a past tense fact. It continues in names carried by descendants, in recipes on kitchen tables, in songs sung at family gatherings, and in objects preserved in attics and museum drawers. The past remains active in the present through these living transmissions. When a family brings a carved toy to a descendant meeting at a museum, when an elder sings a variant hymn at a remembrance ceremony, Those acts are not only memory, they are ongoing preservation, renewed, affirmed, and taught to the next generation. The documentary's closing sequence returns us to the sensory planes with which it began. A quiet winter morning at Monticello again, the roof rimmed with frost, the river dull beyond the fields. This time, the camera lingers on an object in a glass case, an unassuming carved fragment, its tool marks visible in the light. A descendant places a hand near the case, fingers hovering a breath away from the glass. She speaks softly, naming a grandmother, naming a child. The name hangs in the cold air like a vow. In the final voiceover, the film offers its answer to the title's central question: how did enslaved people at Monticello preserve faith, culture, and dignity even amid relentless oppression? The answer is necessarily complex. Preservation was neither singular nor spectacular. It was quotidian, relational, and resilient. It was enacted by songs reshaped into memory, by names spoken across years, by secret stitches and hidden toys, by midwives and pianoless hymnists, by carpenters who carved small talismans, and by the steady labor of telling and retelling family stories. These acts did not erase the violence of separation, but they insisted on a human continuity that law could not fully extinguish. That insistence carries obligations for the present. Historical institutions must continue to invite descendants into the interpretive process, to acknowledge archival silences as silences, to present artifacts with full provenance and interpretive caution, and to teach the public that dignity was preserved through ordinary acts of care as much as through extraordinary resistance. For viewers, the obligation is to approach the past with both curiosity and humility, recognizing that ledger pages offer only part of a human story, and that material culture and oral memory provide essential counterweights. Before the film ends, a brief on-screen caption reminds viewers of the film's methodological choices. Sequences in the film that depict private life are labeled as artistic reconstruction, composite based on multiple documented accounts when shown. Archival quotes and artifacts are cited with repository details. This transparency is part of an ethical documentary practice, distinguishing between what the archive records and what artistic reconstruction illuminates. Final practical information appears on screen as the camera pulls back. Viewers are invited to learn more through a curated list of resources, scholarship, archival repositories, and museum exhibits. The film closes with one last image, a hymn sung a cappella by a descendant group, its melody threaded with the hush of winter air. The lyric stripped to its essential line becomes a charge: we keep the names we love. That single line, repeated, compresses the documentary's argument into a moral and historical thesis. Preservation was a quotidian fidelity carried forward in human voices and small hands. If you wish to explore further, please visit the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's Monticello website, consult the archives listed below, or consider supporting descendant-centered research initiatives. Resources and source citations are provided in the description below. On-screen caption. Artistic reconstructions in this film are composite representations created from multiple documented sources. Where specific archival evidence is shown, repository citations are provided. For production notes and access policies to descendant materials, contact the institutions listed in the end matter. End matter sources and suggested reading. Selected archival repositories, scholarship, and reports. Primary archival repositories and collections. Thomas Jefferson Foundation Monticello Collections, Steward's Accounts, Household Inventories, Archaeological Field Reports, Conservation Records. Randolph County Courthouse Archives, Harrove Estate Steward's Ledger, 1858, Ledger Box 12, Full 43. Randolph County Historical Society Archives, Randolph County Archaeological Survey Records and Harrow Excavation Accession, RCHS-2008-14. National Archives and Records Administration, Federal Era Documents, Manumission Records, and Federal Census Returns for Contextual Demographic Research. Virginia Historical Society, Plantation Estate Papers, Personal Correspondence, and Regional Legal Documents relevant to sales and estate administration. Selected Scholarship and Interpretive Works. Material Lives, Archaeology and the Enslaved Household, Journal of American Archaeology, Special Issue on Plantations and Domestic Artifacts. Singing Memory, Oral Tradition and Family History in Enslaved Communities, Cultural Memory Review. Ledger and Lament, Paper and the Administration of Slavery in the Upper South, Comparative Document Studies. Monticello's Hidden Lives, Archaeology, Archives, and Descendant Collaboration, Museum Studies Quarterly. Midwives, Mothers, and Memory, Gendered Labor of Kinship Under Slavery, Gender and History. Archaeological and Conservation Reports. Thomas Jefferson Foundation Monticello Archaeological Program, Selected Trench Reports and Conservation Notes, available through Monticello Collections.
Randolph County Archaeological Survey, Haro excavations, field notes, context sheets, and cataloged finds, Randolph County Historical Society accession, RCHS-2008-14. Conservation Assessment Report, Wooden Artifacts from Plantation Contexts, Regional Conservation Lab, Methodological Guidelines for Consolidation and Analysis. Oral History and Descendant-Centered Resources, recorded descendant interviews and testimonies held in the Monticello Oral History Project archives, Thomas Jefferson Foundation.
Community-curated exhibits and oral narratives at local historical societies and descendant-organized gatherings, inquiries directed to respective institutional contacts for access and permissions. Further reading for contextualization. Broad overviews of African American religious life and syncretic practices in the antebellum South in academic anthologies and monographs. Studies on material culture and childhood in enslaved contexts, available in specialized edited volumes. Public history guides on collaborative curation and descendant engagement published by museum associations. Production note. All archival citations used in the film correspond to items and accession numbers listed above. For reproduction requests, descendant permissions, and research inquiries, contact the holding repository directly. Permissions and use agreements vary by collection. Closing invitation. For exhibitions, digitized records, and opportunities to learn more about descendant-led projects connected to Monticello and regional plantation histories, see the links in the description. We ask that any outreach to descendant communities be conducted through institutional channels to respect privacy and existing collaborative agreements. Final line, voiceover. Where ledgers sought to order lives into columns, people kept one another in song, stitch, and story, and in doing so held on to a dignity no page could wholly erase.